I'm Tanya Fox, and you're listening to Fox Talks Business Podcast. I started my career in the corporate world, but always played to my own tune and loved to think outside of the box. This didn't always serve me well with the bosses, so I made the decision to become an entrepreneur. And that little seed of entrepreneurial curiosity continued to grow as I branched out into retail, service, and franchise businesses. Now, I have been fortunate to have amazing successes in the last 2 decades, but they did not come without some really big failures and even bigger lessons learned. And that's why I started this podcast, not just to share the failures, but to show you how you can turn every failure into a success. We're going to hear from some amazing humans from around the world that are going to share their stories of the good, the bad, and the motivational entrepreneurial life has to offer. After all, life is too short to make all of the mistakes yourself, so why not learn from each other? And of course, we're going to have some fun, because as I always say, well, you know what? I'll tell you that at the end of the episode. Hello, Foxy listeners. Welcome to the show today. I am so excited about today's guest, mainly because I love discovering like new people and like binging them. But then I got really obsessed with Courtney's stuff, and I know you will too. So I'm so excited to have her. Courtney, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Oh, Tanya, thank you for having me. I am so looking forward to our conversation. We got a lot to dig into.
So for those that haven't been binging you like I have, give us a little bit of history. What is Courtney's story?
Yeah. So I'm Courtney Elmer. I'm the CEO and founder of The Effortless Life and the creator of Pod Launch. And what we do is we help experts use their voices to catalyze positive change in the world. And the way that we specifically do that is through podcasting. We help them create and launch top ranked podcasts that can become the primary source of traffic for their business. What's crazy though, Tanya, is that I never saw myself in a million years teaching podcasting or even having a podcast. Okay. It was like nowhere on my radar because when I graduated from college, like most of us, get your degree, go get a job, work as hard as you can at that job, climb your way up, and then retire. And that was my plan. I didn't really have a plan other than that. I just strove to be the best and to excel wherever I was planted at the time. So I worked in different sectors. I worked in finance, I worked in retail, I worked in textiles and design. And I never really felt like I found my fit.
Right.
Where it was like, oh, I'm excited to go to work. Oh, I'm excited to, build someone else's dream. And I think because deep down, there was always that little voice inside of me that knew that I wanted to own a business of my own at some point. I didn't listen to that voice for a really long time. I ignored it. I pushed it away. And during this time in my early 20s, met the love of my life. We got married. And 2 days after we got home from our honeymoon, I had a follow-up visit scheduled with my doctor for a sinus infection that I'd had a few weeks prior. So I go into the doctor's office that day. I sit down, just expecting him to say, clean bill of health, you're all good. And he walks in that day and he sits down and he looks at me and he says, Courtney, I don't have the expertise to handle your case. So I'm going to turn you over to another doctor in our practice. This is her specialty. This is what she does. And no sooner than the words were out of his mouth, there was a knock at the door and this other doctor walks in. She sits down and she looks at me and she says, Courtney, you have thyroid cancer. And she said, you're the youngest patient I've ever diagnosed. She said, the good news is it's very treatable. She said, but the bad news for you is that you have this aggressive mutation and it started to spread. So we need to operate ASAP. I've cleared a spot on my surgery schedule. I'll see you next Monday at 7. And Tanya, I can remember sitting there and it was like you're in a movie, like when everything just slows down, it's like, boom, 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 boom,
No,
right? And
I was
everything
here
just
for a
goes
sinus
slow.
infection.
Right. I was like, do you have the right person? So in that moment, I was faced with my own mortality and in a way that made me pause, in a way that I don't think I ever would have paused had that not transpired. So in going through treatment and recovery, I knew that I had to make some changes, but I was terrified. Leaving that security of that paycheck, leaving the identity that I had created for myself as this successful corporate person. But I knew I couldn't continue building someone else's dream and ignoring my own gifts and ignoring my own inner voice that was there to guide me, but that I just hadn't been listening to. Because if you were to back up in my childhood history, when I was about 9 years old, my mom and I, we butted heads all the time. I'd go at it with her and I don't even know what I would be fussing at her about. She'd be like, "You're so disrespectful," right? She's trying to teach me how to be respectful towards adults. I get where she was coming from. But her favorite thing to say to me was, "Courtney, your mouth is what gets you in trouble. Go to your room." And I can remember this one day when I was 9 years old, for whatever reason, even though she told me that many times before, I remember walking down the hall to my room that day, and some part of me decided that if all I was going to get was backlash and punished for speaking up and for using my voice, then it wasn't worth using my voice at all.
I feel this story so deeply.
So for the next 20 plus years, I silenced myself. That was how I learned to cope in order to, in my mind, hopefully win the affection and the affirmation and the love of those that mattered to me. Of course, looking at it now, it's like going about that all wrong, right? And that's how most of our coping mechanisms are. They're there to protect us. And at the time, I didn't realize that what it was actually doing was hurting me from blossoming into the person that I was uniquely created to be. So when I got that diagnosis, this was the part that I didn't mention earlier. My doctor also said that day, she said, "Courtney, of course, as your doctor, I have to let you know the risks of this surgery. And the main one is that because of where your thyroid sits, when we go to remove it, if my hand slips, if anything doesn't go according to plan in that OR, your vocal cords could be permanently severed."
Fantastic.
Great, right? So in that moment, not only was I faced with my own mortality and like these huge life decisions of like, oh my gosh, I'm not living, what I need to be doing, and the sense of urgency to like hurry up and make changes. It was also this fear, this crippling fear, like, what if I would never be able to speak again? And that was terrifying. It was also really ironic for someone who had silenced herself for, 20 years prior.
Yeah.
But
I
the
just
irony
did
was
that
not
for 20 years to myself.
like, wait a minute. So the irony wasn't lost on me. And I wish I could say that I walked away, from that experience and I had started my business and, grew it to 6 figures and grew it to 7 figures and everything was great. And it didn't really work like that. It's taken me 8 years to connect the dots and actually realize that the work I do in the world is the work that this is work I'm supposed to do. It's the work I've always been supposed to be doing. And it took me a really long time to see that because I had become so accustomed and so attuned to listening to the outside voices that told me what I should do or that told me what they thought I was good at and therefore should focus on. And I had gotten into the habit of ignoring my own voice. So I love what I do because I feel, just like you said, this story resonates so deeply with you. I feel we all have our own voice story in one shape or form or another. And when we enter into this world of business, for most of us, it's to create positive change. It's to create a difference in the world. We want to help people. We're not motivated by the money. We know we need the money to pay our teams and keep the lights on and those sorts of things, but it's not like we're setting out there and the money is the end all be all. There's something beyond that gets us out of bed every day, that makes us put our feet on the floor and say, this is why I'm showing up today. And for so many of us, because we've learned through the years to stifle our own voices, we often get into a place in business where we're running that business out of fear. Fear of what other people will think if we decide this or that. Fear of what other people will say if we do this or that. And we become very, very tuned into the voices outside of us and less tuned into the voice inside. Until often for many people, I just had a conversation with someone literally this morning about this, who was telling me, I like what I do. It pays the bills. I've built this business, but I feel like there's something else that my heart is telling me I need to do. And then, of course, the conversation about all the fears that are coming up and all the excuses and the reasons as to why you can't just take the leap and go do that thing, right? Because of all these other reasons. So before we get into any conversation about business strategy or podcasting or amplifying your voice or anything else that we're going to talk about today, for you listening, I really want you to hear this, that one of the most important lessons that we all have to learn on our business journey is not only to listen to our inner voice, but to trust it. I'm still learning how to do that. It's not easy, but it is required if we want to fulfill the dream and the calling that we feel we've been put on this earth to do.
I love that. And I think it's so true because I think even, when I look on my journey, there's been oftentimes that I've made decisions in business and it took a long time for me to come to terms, I guess is the easiest way, that no matter what explanation I give, there's always going to be somebody who doesn't understand or agree with it. And that it doesn't matter if it makes sense to somebody else. Like when I've had multiple businesses and people, they look at it and they're like, this doesn't make sense. And I realize it doesn't have to. Like it's not it's not for you. I'm not building this, for you. The explanation is, but you're right in what you say, that and oftentimes we get stuck in trying to make sure that what we're doing or what we're producing or what we're putting out in the world is going to make sense to everybody. And then we sort of lose that voice. And when you were telling your story, I like when I said it resonated so deeply is that for the longest time, I was told as a kid that I was a lot. Like,
Mm.
I would hear relatives say that, like, at, Christmas, everybody would get together, and, of course, I've come from a very loud family, so everybody got louder to be heard, and 10 conversations were happening at once, and, but then I would get told, I would be, like, telling a story, and they'd be like, "Okay, you need to, like, calm down. You're just, like, a little bit much," but I would be looking at the room and going, "What the hell are you talking about? Like, I'm matching you guys, like, what is kinda going on?" But for the longest time, I think, I think we can all relate to that we go, okay, like I'll be a little bit less, I'll be a little bit less. And now the older I get, the more that I go, I can't believe I ever did that. Like it's so freeing. Like I look at like elderly ladies as like these mecca people who just say what they want. And I think, how freeing is that when I see like an older lady at a grocery, just like say what's on her mind. And people are like, oh my God. And they're like just shocked that this sentence or this perspective came out of this lady's mouth. And I thought, she just looks like she was like, it's just gone. Like she's very lifted. She's like, I had a thought, I said it, and now it's over, and I'm like, oh, that's just like my goal. It's my
Yes,
target in life.
I love it. Well, and it makes me think of how, we do tend to mold ourselves to fit the boxes that other people present for us. The problem is that everybody has a different box for
Yeah.
us. And there is no way that we'll ever be able to fit all of those boxes. We know this logically, but there's that deeper human need there to be understood, to be heard, to be valued. There are 5 emotional needs that every human has. Those are 3 of them.
Yeah.
And that is a need that drives all of us. We want to belong. We want to feel accepted. And I think that sometimes, while well intentioned, we all need to fill that need. It also gets in the way because we search for different ways to fill that need that, unbeknownst to us, are really unhealthy, trying to become someone we're not.
Mhm.
And to your point, it's so funny when you look at like elderly ladies, or I've even had people tell me, by the time you turn 50, none of that, bother you anymore. And I'm like, I got a long way to go till 50. I don't want to just wait till I turn 50 for something to happen in my life, right? When I can actually become the agent in that change and make those decisions now and speak up for myself. And not just the speaking up part, but to trust what I have to say so that I can use my voice freely. And it's been a journey because I've had to unlearn everything that I had taught myself to survive all those years prior. And that to me is the hardest part. And I think for most of us, we want that. We want that freedom. We can see, I mean, for you listening right now, you can probably say, yes, like, gosh, I relate to this too. And I would just love to be able to speak what's on my mind and not worry about, haters in the DMs or the comments on Instagram, or, to be able to send out an email and say what I think without worrying someone's going to reply and say, oh my gosh, I'm unfollowing you, or that a slew of unsubscribes are going to come through because we said something that might have been to us that felt maybe controversial. But the freedom in doing that. And I've always admired the people who have done that. And I think about the voices throughout our history that have shaped history. Look at, I mean, doesn't matter your political beliefs, your religious beliefs. I think we can all look at historical figures, say like Mother Teresa or Martin Luther King Jr. or Nelson Mandela or Rosa Parks, all of who shared their voices in their own way for the cause that they believed in, and who have left a legacy that shaped history because of it. We wouldn't be where we are in the world without voices like theirs, and so many others, of course, too, who have made that contribution. So when I think about that, when we zoom out for a minute and think about this as business owners and the impact that we have the potential to make, we're always saying we want to create a greater impact. We want to create a greater impact. How do we actually do that? I think it starts with trusting what we have to say first, and then stepping forth in courage to say it. Courage doesn't mean there won't be fear. It just means you're doing it anyway in spite of the fear. And that we stop giving so much weight and power to the opinions of others who are all going to forget about you when you're dead anyway. It's not going to matter, right? So I think we give so much of our power away, we don't realize it. And as business owners, it's an even deeper calling that we have to use our voice in really, really meaningful ways, ways that can actually bring about change. Because look at it, you have a business. You're not working under this corporate entity that, you're just another number where your voice gets lost. You have a platform just by having a business. And you can certainly build other platforms too, like a podcast or other platforms to where you can share that voice to reach more people. But your business is a platform in and of itself. Your message matters. And I think so often we focus on, bringing in the clients and bringing in the income and growing the following. And how can I grow my email list? That we lose the power that actually drives that growth in the first place, which is being who we are and leading because we are fully stepping into who we've been created to be.
So after you kind of went all through this, what attracted you to starting a podcast?
So at the time in my business, I was about 4 years or so in business, and I was struggling to grow. I was on that income roller coaster where you didn't know what you were going to get that month, right? It might be zero, might be 10K, might be somewhere in between. It might be higher than 10K. It was just so unpredictable, and there was no way to project it either. So I knew, because I listened to tons of podcasts and I was out there following all these experts who had successful 7 and 8 figure businesses, that, okay, leads in sales, they go hand in hand. So if you don't have the sales you want, well, we got to work on the lead flow, right? And just starting to understand how all of those facets work together. Well, my son was also 18 months old at the time. I was brand new mom, and I had him home by choice. I didn't have him in daycare. So not only was I struggling to grow my business, I was struggling to actually work at all, because the only time I had to work was in those little nap time, like nooks and
Yep,
crannies.
I remember
of the day,
those.
right?
Yeah.
And it was tough because I just like my income was unpredictable. I also did not know how long he was going to nap on any given day. I might get 2 hours, I might get 20 minutes. So here I was trying to grow my business in these little bitty pockets of time, always complaining, oh, I wish I had more time. I wish I had more time. But one of the only times that I had in the day where I was hands free was when I could strap him into the stroller and like load him up with snacks. And we'd go for long walks in the neighborhood. And I would just put my AirPods in and I would just binge listen to these podcasts. Any expert, you name it, I listen to them. Amy Porterfield and James Wedmore and, Jenna Kutcher and all of these people who have been voices for us leaders in, our businesses and in growing businesses through the years. And I was listening to all these things they were telling me to do, and I was getting more overwhelmed by the minute because I'm like, surely I don't have any more time to do this, right? I can't even get, like, Instagram stories had pretty much just come out at that point. Like, reels weren't even on the scene. I'm like, I could barely get stories up, much less create posts, much less send out a weekly email, much less take care of my clients, do sales calls in the, nap time window of the day. So I was already looking for a way to better leverage my time in my business. But here I was listening to all these experts tell me what to do. And one day it just dawned on me that I wasn't paying any attention to what they were actually doing, which was podcasting. And if you look at 99.9% of the experts that you follow, they all have at least one long form platform in their business. For most of them, it's a podcast. For some of them, it's a book. For some of them, it's a blog. For some of them, it's all of those things. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it because I'm like, wait a minute. So here's the topic we just listened to on their podcast this week. And well, their email just hit my inbox. And guess what? It's on the same topic. And here's the social content that just hit my Instagram feed. And guess what? It's talking about the same thing. And suddenly I could see how the podcast for them was the source of all the other content in their business. And something sparked in me because there were two things that I was looking for at that time. One, like I mentioned, a better way to leverage my time. And two, a deeper connection with my community than I felt that I was getting, from a 100-word Instagram caption or a 15-second video. There were topics that I wanted to explore in a deeper way. And let's be real. I mean, content gets shorter and shorter and shorter. There's no way. I mean, now it's down to like 7 seconds or the first 6 seconds, and it's like, how are you possibly going to create value, build trust, build rapport, and do all that in 7 seconds? And then later on in my journey, someone told me, yeah, did you know someone now has to spend over 7 hours with you before they're ready to make a buying decision? I was like, what? They're like, yes, 7
But I have
hours.
6 seconds to get them to
Right.
want to spend time
Imagine
with
how
me.
many videos, I mean, I did the math at one point. I think it was like 3,400 7-second reels or something like that.
Yeah.
I'm like, what? Who had, like, no, just throw in the towel now. I'm not doing it. So I overthought my podcast for a good 9 months before I hit publish, before I decided to launch it. But looking back, the only regret I have is not starting it sooner. Because what it has done for my business, it's completely transformed the trajectory of my business. I didn't start podcasting for it to become this number one source of leads in my marketing and for it to be the thing that people would hop on sales calls and say, oh my gosh, so I just listened to the last episode of your podcast. That's what made me book this call. That's why I'm here. Like, I've been listening to you. I heard you on so-and-so's podcast. I heard you on this. I've been listening to your podcast. It's now like the cornerstone. It's the core touch point that everyone that I talk to has touched before they get to me. And it's amazing how easy it is to build rapport, to build trust, to really build connection with people. And we all know that we need that. That's a prerequisite to make any kind of sale. And it's becoming increasingly harder to do with the short form platforms that we have available to us because they're so crowded. So that's how I got started in podcasting. Again, never saw myself teaching it. What happened from there was I launched it. We had over 65 5-star reviews that came in within the first week. And I was like, wow, people were saying, this is the podcast I've been needing. Why haven't you started? This is awesome. This is exactly what I need to hear. And that felt really good. But then I had people in my network starting to reach out to me and they were like, well, I've been thinking of launching a podcast. What did you do to get those results? And eventually I had so many people reaching out over the span of that summer. I'd launched it that spring. Over that summer, people were reaching out to me. I'm like, look, let's get together. This was in the peak of COVID. So like, let's have some Zoom meetings, right? Hop on Zoom. I'll share with you guys what I did. You take it, you run with it. That became the very first beta version of what is now Pod Launch. I resisted fully focusing, becoming a podcast expert for the longest time. I think because I hadn't made peace with my voice yet, and I didn't fully trust it. So I ran that program under the radar for many years, alongside our other bread and butter program, which was focused on business systems. Until within the past year, it became really obvious to me what was holding me back. And it was the other program, because that was the thing that other people had told me I needed to focus on, not the thing that I knew I was truly meant to do. So now that's what we do. We help people elevate their voice in the podcasting space and also utilize that as a tool to grow their business. But it's been just a really weird path of twists and turns to get here.
Well, and I think for a lot of people, like, I remember, thinking, like, I had always listened to podcasts as well. And I was in the midst of closing a store that was successful, but I didn't like people anymore. And it was just, I knew I knew in my heart, I'm like, it's time for me to let this go. Which was in
2018. So I'm so grateful I did, because I didn't have to deal with COVID and go through all of that stuff. I was like, oh, well, that was good that I did it at the time I did it. But for me, it was the same thing. It wasn't, the whole reason why I started it is I knew I needed to find something to do. I knew I had a year that I could like do whatever I wanted, like I had built this cushion where I was like, I can just kind of like play around, but I also knew I would get really lazy. And I remember talking with my son and saying, I want to do a podcast. And he's like, I don't know what that is. And I'm like, it's like a radio show, I guess. And then he was like, so talking? And I'm like, yeah, it's all talking. And he goes, yep, do that, Mom. And I'm like, oh, you like that idea? And he goes, oh, I don't really know what you're talking about, but you talking seems like a no-brainer. Like you just do that a lot. So I was like, okay.
From the mouths of babes, right? It's like,
right.
Oh, thank you,
and
honey.
So I didn't really I did a lot of research into like the platforms and microphones and like all that other stuff, but I didn't really dive into the statistics of it until probably a year later. And I was starting to hear all of these things of like how many people start a podcast and like how many are out there and how many never get past like a certain amount of episodes. And I was really surprised by that. Because I think for me, it was an outlet for me is what I was using it for, a way that I could just kind of get out whatever I was thinking without having that censorship. Because I found that for me, like on social media, I always felt that censorship of like, can I say this word? Or maybe I have to redo it again, or I have to dance? Now I have to find music. Like it just seemed like a lot. And so it was, for me, I was like, this is an opportunity for me to kind of like step up on a soapbox and just like kind of say what's on my mind. But I think for a lot of people who's, and correct me if I'm wrong, still to this day, a lot of people who, start podcasts are like, I just need to get that statistic of like 10 episodes out of my way. But then what do I do? Right? Like I'm doing, like you had said, like in business, I'm doing the things, I'm being consistent. I'm putting an episode out, weekly. I'm interviewing people, but I'm still stuck where I feel like I'm not reaching those, 65 reviews or, 10,000 downloads, but people are telling me now I have to monetize and now I'm getting stuck in this. So what would your advice be for those people who are like, I'm doing what they tell me to do and it's not working?
Yes. Oh, it's such a big question because it is the thing that most people get frustrated with when they get into the podcasting space. And just to put some numbers around this, at the time of this recording, there are over 3 million podcasts. That sounds like a lot. Compare that to the 1+ billion users on YouTube or social media as a whole. That's not a lot. But in the niche itself, okay, 3 million podcasts. So I'm competing with these people. The other thing you got to realize, though, is that not all 3 million of those are active, just like you said. It's amazing when we sit down and we do research for our clients, so many podcasts that we come across, 1 episode, 2 episodes, never to be heard from again. And in the industry, there's a term for podcasters who release at least an episode a week and have done so consistently for at least a year or more without missing. And it's called actively established podcasts. There are only 60,000 actively established podcast hosts.
Wow.
So when you look at that, you see that, and from a business owner perspective, we all know the blue ocean strategy, right? And how important that is to go where people aren't. We have a huge opportunity still within the podcasting space. We're just getting started. Now, what most people are under the misconception of is, well, to be successful with a podcast, I need a big audience. And I totally get why people would think that, because you look at like the Amy Porterfields and the Brendan Burchards and all these people with these huge podcasts and these huge numbers. I mean, even Joe Rogan, even if you don't listen to him, we all know the name, right? Or Andrew Huberman. It's like everybody knows who those people are thanks to their podcast. So we think we need that to be successful. But if you look back, Joe Rogan was actually podcasting before Snapchat, before Twitter ever existed. Jordan Harbinger, same thing. He started his podcast, I don't know, 2006, I think it was. Like that was before Twitter ever hit the scene. Amy Porterfield, Tim Ferriss, they were doing it before we had Instagram to the point where it is now. TikTok didn't exist. And I know for a fact that all of them started with exactly 0 downloads. So the question isn't, how big of an audience do I need to start with to be successful with a podcast? It's how can I position my podcast in such a way to attract the right audience so that I can grow? Because just like most of these hosts, they started their shows prior to having the big audience that they now have online, because those online platforms didn't even exist. So what we have to do first when we look at podcasting and being successful in the podcasting space, aside from defining what success means to you, right? Is it downloads? Is it conversions? Is it enrolling more clients from your podcast? Because surprisingly, client enrollments can be done with very low download numbers. You don't need thousands and thousands of downloads to increase enrollments into your programs if that's your goal. But what we do need is we need really, really precise positioning in the podcast space. So when we look at a podcast, if someone comes to us, and usually we work with two types of people. So one type is the person who has always wanted to launch a podcast. It's been on their bucket list for years now. And it's also been on the back burner because they want to do it right. They're worried they're not going to have time to keep up with it. They're worried, well, what if I run out of things to say? I mean, here I am using this as this platform to be this expert. If I run out of things to say, that's embarrassing, right? So they're worried about that. Maybe they bought the mic. It's sitting on their office shelf collecting dust. They haven't done anything with it. They haven't recorded a single episode. And they just want the systems and the framework so that they know that when they put their time into it, and this was me in the beginning too, because I only had so much time to give. I didn't want endless amounts of trial and error. I wanted to know that, okay, I could start this thing and that it would become successful in a relatively short period of time so that I could grow it from there. And we find that most people who haven't started podcasts, but who toy with the idea of it, it's like that recurring dream that never goes away. It's like this recurring idea, right? This thought that won't leave you alone. That's where they are, right? In looking to start. On the flip side of that, you've got your podcast hosts who have made it past those 10 episodes. And they're still getting less than 100 downloads per episode. That 1,000 download per episode milestone feels like this far off mirage in the desert. Does it even exist? Can I even get there?
Yeah.
And they're doing everything that they know how to do to grow their show. I mean, they share it every week with their email list. They post about it on social media. They ask their guests to share it out. They've dabbled in SEO. They've appeared as guests on other podcasts. And still it has virtually no impact to their download numbers every week. And worse, they're not seeing people raise their hand to say, hey, can I work with you? Or book a call and hop on that sales call. And then suddenly you're face to face with someone who's like, listen, I've been listening to your podcast for the past 6 months. I really like what you have to offer. And, I would love to explore what it looks like to work with you. Like, that's not even happening. Like,
Yeah,
it's
they're
not even
like,
a
I know
conversation.
people are listening because
Right.
I have some downloads, and I know they're not all my mom.
Right.
But why aren't they talking to me? Yeah,
Why
right.
aren't they talking to me? So no matter where you are, if you're listening to this right now, maybe you have a podcast that's not growing like you expected it to. Maybe you've been thinking of launching one, but you just kind of have some, concerns and hesitations around that because you want to do it right. You want to make sure you're utilizing your time. That's not just going to be another shiny object. What we first have to understand is that there are 3 things that make a podcast successful. The 3 things I'm about to share with you are probably 3 things you've never heard about before, unless you've heard me share these things with you before on another episode or at one of my workshops. Because nobody is talking about this. These 3 things it's not something you can Google. It's not something you'll find on YouTube. And it has nothing to do with the size of your audience, the quality of your microphone, or the hosting platform that you choose. It has everything to do, going back to what I mentioned about positioning, with how you're communicating the value of what you have to offer. What most people don't realize, as podcast hosts, yes, we have this platform. Yes, we can use our voices. Yes, we're doing that in service of others. But what a lot of hosts don't realize is that there's 2 types of communication. There's conscious communication, and there's unconscious or subconscious communication. Most of us are good at the conscious communication part. Another way to look at this is verbal and nonverbal, right? We know that 7% of communication is verbal. It's what we say. But how many times have you been in an argument with someone you love and it's like, well, honey, it's not what you said, it's how you said it. And it's the 93% that's unconscious, but that makes the biggest difference and the biggest impact. So what most hosts do is they think, okay, if I can just buy the best mic that I can afford, figure out where to plug it in, get up the courage to record these episodes and then hit publish, that if my content's good enough, people are going to listen.
Yeah. If I say it, they'll come.
Yes. Yes. And I say it this way. I'm like, look, you would never spend over a year writing a book only to hit publish on Amazon and cross your fingers, tell no one, hope that it becomes a bestseller. Would you? No, like we all know it doesn't work like that. And that when these big people who we admire have these book launches, there's a lot that goes into that, right? They've got a launch team, they've got people backing the launch. There's a lot of work that goes into making that book successful. But yet, what do people do with podcasts? They plug in the mic, they hit record, they hit publish, they tell no one except for maybe the one post that they put out on Instagram saying, hey guys, I have a podcast now. And they sit back and they hope that people will listen. And they are dismayed to find out that, 10 episodes in, they're only getting 20 to 30 downloads per episode. And they're like, this is a lot of work. I want to be getting some return for this, for my time. And I totally get that. And I totally agree. You should be getting some return for your time. But what they haven't yet realized is how to communicate unconsciously with their audience. This is the one thing that 99% of podcast hosts are not doing. So just by doing this, you're already putting yourself in the top 1% of hosts who understand this really important element of communication when we're looking to attract new listeners. So those three things. The first is a binge-worthy content formula, because it doesn't matter how good the content is inside your episodes if nobody knows how good that content is going to be, if nobody knows that it's worth their time to listen. That's kind of like opening a bakery on the little downtown street corner in your city, and you've got the best baked goods on the planet. Oh my gosh, those vegan chocolate chip cookies, like to die for. You put it in your mouth, it melts in your mouth, it just, everybody loves them. They're going to sell. Except you flip the open sign, you tell nobody, and you sit there and you hope that people are just going to find you. If nobody knows how good your stuff is, why should they care? And the same is true in podcasting. So a lot of people think if I just have the best episode content, the highest value episode content, people are just going to find it. What they don't realize is that there's actually 5 steps of the listener journey that a listener has to go through before they decide whether they want to hit play. And it all happens unconsciously. So if we don't know how to communicate, I call them your 5 content gatekeepers. And if we don't know how to, through those gatekeepers, communicate to your listener that this show is relevant to them, that it addresses a specific problem or problems that they are looking to have solved, that it offers a real solution to those problems, and that it is worth their time to listen, you're going to lose them. And this is why for most hosts who come to us with existing podcasts that aren't growing, I'm like, look, you're doing a lot of right things on the growth piece, right? There's a lot of tactics out there and strategies to grow a podcast. But you've got leaky holes in your bucket right now. And if we don't go back and plug those holes first and really solidify the foundation, the messaging foundation of your podcast, all the growth, the time that you're spending on growth strategies, it's going to be wasted because you're not going to be able to retain the listeners who do find you. So the binge-worthy content formula, and I just want to be clear, it's not just about the content in your episodes, but it's about how are we communicating to your listener before they get to hit play, before they get to that button, to attract them to your show, to create enough curiosity to get them to hit play and keep them listening and ultimately convert them. So I'll just give one really quick example. We don't have time to dive into all 5 gatekeepers. But the first one of these is your cover art. And this one often flies under the radar. We want good looking cover art, but we often don't think about the positioning of our artwork against other podcasts of our kind. So if you were to go to the marketing category, either in Apple Podcasts on your phone or on your computer, and you were to pull up, let's say marketing, and you were looking at the top 10 podcasts, you just took a quick screenshot. Amy Porterfield is usually hovering somewhere in those top 10 slots. And if you were to look at that screenshot, you kind of squint your eyes and you notice most of the artwork in that category uses really bright, warm colors. There's a lot of hot pinks There's some bright yellows, oranges, reds, and then we see some deeper colors like navy blue and black. Amy, though, whether she realized this or not, did the opposite. And it was the smartest move she could have made for her podcast at this stage in the listener journey. Because when a listener goes to listen to podcasts, there's one of two main ways that they find podcasts, either by hearing that guest on another podcast or by browsing the charts of interest. Sometimes by typing in keywords, right? But that eventually will bring you to a chart. It brings you to a podcast, a listing of podcasts. And what you see first is the cover art before you even look at the title. Now, it happens so quickly, you often don't even register it because it's an unconscious thing. You're not sitting there logically going, oh my gosh, that cover art, it is so well designed.
Yeah, this
I
is in
spent
the right
thousands of
spot.
dollars on that. It's beautiful, right? Like, no, it happens in the split second, the blink of an eye. But what Amy's artwork does by being different, her background is light gray. Her shirt is like this light chambray blue. The only warm color we see is a little yellow box behind her name. And what it does is it immediately draws your eye away from the other podcasts because it's different. And that's the first step to grabbing our listeners' attention. From there, they'll look at the title. If that hooks them in, then they'll click in and read the description. And then go through your episode titles, your show notes, and then and only then get to the point where they're ready to hit play or not. So we want to make sure that all those gatekeepers are aligned to not only attract the right listener to your show, but to keep them listening and to ultimately convert them. And that's just ingredient number one. I promised you two more, but I'm going to pause here because I'm sure you might have questions.
No, I think this is all great because I think this is something that in other areas, I think a lot of people, thought about. And sometimes it takes that person to like remind you. Like, I remember when I was getting ready to publish the book, like I had to like fight for the color that I wanted because they were like, well, typically we don't see that. And I was like, yeah, I know. That's the whole point. Like, I literally went to bookshelves where I knew it was going to be. And I was like, what color do I not see the most, and is also a color that I like, obviously, because I'm going to have to hold this stupid book forever. But we don't think about that, right? But for me, it was like, that's what stands out to me. Like, as I scan books at the bookstore, there's so many. It's that one that like, is a different color or, is just different than all of the rest. That makes me go, oh, what's this all about? Kind of thing. So I think this is good to help people kind of go, am I standing out or am I just doing what everybody else did? So I just blend in with everybody else.
Exactly. And this is inherent throughout every element of your podcast. I mean, even episode titles, because think of an existing listener, right? A new listener might be browsing for new shows to listen to. So things like the cover art, the show title, those things are really going to matter for them and make or break the deal of earning them as a listener or losing them. But for an existing listener, if they're following your show and they have notifications turned on, they're going to get a notification when you publish a new episode. What are they going to see? The episode title. So it goes down to the difference between, let's say you have an episode on, growing your following online. That's really vague. But let's say it's, how to grow your following on social media without posting every day, right? Let's just say that's the title versus 3 content mistakes you're making right now that are causing you to lose potential followers to your competition. And it's like, well, which one would you be more likely to listen to? I'd be more likely to listen to the one where you tell me what mistakes I'm making so I can go and fix those. That to me is higher value content than you teaching me more things that I need to add to my plate to do in order to achieve some sort of result. So it's even down to how we're communicating, what we're communicating. And this is inherent through all of those content gatekeepers and especially in your episodes, because ultimately that and the structure of that episode is what's going to lead that person to the point of conversion. When they hear your call to action, and now we're inviting them, the first action is to hit play or not. The second action is to do whatever you're asking them to do at the end of the episode, whether it's download a lead magnet or book a call with you or register for a workshop or whatever that might be. So the binge-worthy content piece is huge, and 99% of hosts are missing this. From there, though, what we want to look at is ingredient number 2, which I call it your launch and relaunch system. Because if you're starting a podcast for the first time, just like you would never spend 2 years writing a book, hit publish on Amazon and tell no one, Well, the same is true with a podcast. We need to have a strategic launch plan to launch your show, create buzz around it with a twofold intention of number one, getting it on the charts so that it can get discovered by more potential listeners. And number two, finding out how many downloads is it going to take to get on those charts so that when we get to ingredient number three, which is long-term growth, I'll give you a little spoiler alert there, that we can actually design that growth plan to help you maintain those results and keep you on the charts, to keep you getting discovered. But the same is true for an existing podcast. And I get this question a lot. Well, Courtney, I've already started my podcast. Do I need to launch it again? And the answer is, well, if you've never launched it, or if you've hit a plateau and you haven't been able to break past it, then yes. Because the launch and relaunch system, the beauty of it, it's kind of like, you know, those little 5-hour energy drinks, the ones I used to like
Yep.
down in college that drank way too many of those things. But it's kind of like a 5-hour energy for your podcast, or a vitamin B shot, where it's going to give you that boost in momentum. So if you're starting a podcast for the first time, you know, like I mentioned earlier, everyone starts at 0 downloads. But if you can increase those numbers on the first day that you launch, you'll suddenly be growing from a higher trajectory than everyone else. You'll have a higher baseline to grow from and setting yourself up for faster growth over time versus starting at 0 and just kind of trotting along, hoping that people find your show and, you know, eventually, okay, 10 downloads. Okay, now I'm at 20. Great. It's been 6 months, you know, and
Yeah.
that process just takes a really long time. So it accelerates that process. For an existing podcast, though, it is especially important if you're trying to break through a plateau, because what it does is it revitalizes your podcast, helps you potentially get on those charts, which this is not an ego play, right? It's nice to have some bragging rights and oh, I'm top 100 podcast, you know, but what we really care about is keeping you there, right? It only means so much if you're just hit those charts one time.
Yeah. I was there for 5
But
minutes.
right. But getting on those charts is really important. We have a client at the time that we're recording this, she launched today. She is charting currently in 4 different countries already just this morning. And now she is visible to a global audience of her ideal clients. Now, these are some big countries too. Okay. I'm not talking like little bitty countries nobody's heard of. It's the US, it's India, which is where she's based, it's Australia, and the UK. So this is huge for her in reaching the audience that she wants to reach. And we're only a few hours into her launch. So it's really important because when you get in the charts, again, and I want to be clear, it's not for ego, but it's for discoverability. Because as of right now, SEO is nowhere near Google or YouTube in the podcasting space. We got a long way to go. You might get found through a keyword search. You might get found if you're heard as a guest on another podcast and people go back and find your podcast. But the best place to get discovered is the charts. So that's why we want to get you there, because that's where new potential listeners are the most likely to find you for the least amount of energy output or effort output, right? Because going on a podcast tour is great, but that takes a lot of work on top of already producing your podcast, on top of running your business. So that's ingredient number 2. And then from there, I already hinted at this, is where we shift gears. Once your podcast is up and running, once we've established this baseline or this new baseline for your podcast, and then we shift to long-term audience growth, or long-term growth for short, because this is going to be the name of the game for your show from here on out. And I also want to be transparent that there's an element of time here that when you have ingredient number 1 and 2 in place, that time will be working on your side. It will still take time to grow. Just like it's taken these experts 10, 12, 15 years to get their podcast to the size and the level that they are. So you first need to be committed for the long haul, right? This is a commitment to your audience. This is like a marriage, right? You're in it. And you're committing by doing a podcast to showing up at least once a week to serve your community on this platform, in this medium. But we want to accelerate that timeline if we can. Because nobody wants to wait 12 years to hit 1 million downloads, right? If we can hit it sooner. So by laying the foundation with ingredients 1 and 2, you'll have a really strong foundation to grow from. So what we look at in this piece of the process is how many downloads did you get when you launched? We'll run those numbers. We'll debrief that launch. If you charted, amazing. We're going to look at how many downloads it took to get there. And we want to build a growth strategy designed to help you maintain those numbers so that you can continue to chart. If you didn't chart, that's okay. It was still a successful launch. You still got your podcast out there. The bulk of the work is done. I mean, that's to be celebrated, charting or no charting. But now we know that we need to design a growth plan that maybe is a little more aggressive to help get you over that hump, to get you on the charts, to then maintain. And this is a process of trial and error to some degree. It's trial and error with guidance, right? Because you can trial and error it on your own and throw all that spaghetti at the wall, or you can have someone looking over your shoulder and saying, interesting that those numbers did that. Let's try this.
Yeah.
Or interesting that we're seeing this plateau now. Let's adjust this. So it's really more of a process of tweaking, should I say, than trial and error, right? At that point, because you're just tweaking these little micro adjustments to help bring about the best result that you can for the longevity of your podcast.
Well, and I think this is the difference of having somebody who, you know, has that experience behind them, because you go through the trial and error, but you have somebody that has the fixes. Whereas I think what happens with a lot of people is they're like, yeah, I tried that. It didn't work. I tried that.
Right.
It didn't work. Right. And so instead of, you know, knowing how to analyze that and look at it, you're just going, nah, that didn't work for me. Like no, that didn't work. But I love what you also said about the relaunch and talking about it as if it's the first time people are hearing this, because like, to me, it brought up the thought of like, I live in a small town, and I don't know how many times, like, well, I closed my store in 2018 and people still online, or, you know, people will say like, if you could have any business in town, what would you want? And then people were like, oh, I wish we would have had a craft store at some point. And I'm like, you had one for 5 fucking years and you never did anything with it. But it was funny because it was like, it's so true. It doesn't matter how small or big of a community, there's those hidden gems where you're like, oh my God, I didn't even know we have that. Like, we have a pottery paint place in town. Like, I didn't even know that, right? Because we don't drive around. We don't tend to tour our, you know, the places where we live. And I think, you know, it's the same thing with our businesses, whether it's a podcast or your business. Like, you need to let people know that you exist, because not everybody's driving around and like snooping and going, okay, what has opened? What's new? What's still here? What do I need to revisit? They just don't think about it until it's in their face and they're like, oh yeah. You know, and you get that memory again that you're like, oh yeah, I used to love that place.
100%. And it just boggles my mind to no end how very few podcast hosts even talk about their podcast. In conversation, it's almost like it's difficult for them to say, well, I have a podcast. Here's a link. You
Yeah.
should go listen, right? But yet we have opportunities that come up naturally in conversation. And so if nobody else, let me back up for a second. As the host of your podcast, you're responsible for creating the buzz around it. Just like you're responsible for marketing your business, just like you're responsible for getting clients in the door. Yes, you may hire other people at some point to share in those responsibilities. But at the end of the day, the onus is on you. And I think for us as podcast hosts, we tend to want to defer that responsibility to other people. As business owners too, I'm guilty of this. Okay. So I'm not like pointing fingers or anything here. I am so guilty of this in my business, where I have thrown money at people to help me fix problems that ultimately I was the only person who could fix, because I needed to decide which direction we were going to go, or I needed to decide what we stood for and what our values were. And those types of situations where nobody can decide that stuff for me, right? They might be able to come in and teach me a strategy to help me with one thing or another when those things have been decided. Perfect case in point. I'd hired some copywriters. This was over a year ago at this point. Brilliant women. It was a team of 2 women. Loved their copy. I mean, you talk about binging stuff on social media. I like have their alerts turned on. Like, I love when they share stuff. They're so good. They don't offer one-on-one work anymore, but at the time they were. And I filled out their application. They had accepted me. They had over 150 applicants. They could only work with like 15 of them. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is like a dream coming true. This is amazing. So I put down my deposit. They were like, so we're not going to be able to kick off our work for about 8 months. And I was like, oh, okay, whatever. I'll wait, whatever it takes. So by the time all was said and done, it had been almost a year before we had that kickoff date on the calendar and we were set to start working with one another. And deep down, because I was at a place in my business at the time where I was really afraid to let go of this other program that I mentioned earlier that really was the thing holding me back. But I had spent so much time and energy and effort to create it. It was like, oh, I don't want to let that go, right? There's all my effort out the window. I really had to shift my perspective there. But what I was hoping with these copywriters was that they could come in and fix that for me and make it so that my messaging just made it all make sense, which to your point doesn't have to make sense. But I was hoping that they could help me with that. Well, about a week or two before we were scheduled to have our kickoff call, I get an email in my inbox saying, we've had some personal issues come up that we need to tend to. And for that reason, we're canceling all contracts now through the end of the year. We've refunded your money. They gave me like a peace offering of one of their, do it yourself. Like, here's how to write your own copy for your website if you want to do this. And I was like devastated. Because not only
Yeah.
had I waited almost a year to kick
You
this
were my
project
answer.
off, right? Exactly. It was the best thing that could have ever happened because I had to sit down and decide on what did we stand for? What is the deeper message behind what we do? The only way that I could have ever been able to communicate that effectively is if I got clear on it first. My why, my purpose for getting out of bed every day. I had to reconnect to that. And so I am so grateful that that happened. Yes, at first I was a little annoyed by it, and I understood like personal stuff comes up all the time. I get it. But looking back, it was not their responsibility to fix those problems in my business for me. That responsibility was mine. And that goes back to owning your voice and trusting your voice. And so we just have to take this and apply it to our podcast too. You're responsible for creating the buzz. Talk about your show. If you believe in the work that you do, if you believe that your work can help people, and you're in a conversation with someone, whether that's online or in person, where that comes up, share it. It's like podcast growth 101, right? Yet so many people don't even do that. And we think all these big strategies and these tactics and these podcast funnels to get people from the, listening into our programs. Like we tend to turn our attention to all of those things when sometimes growth is really just the most basic element of being your biggest fan, not in a prideful way, but being your biggest fan, showing up to serve and giving it enough time. I mean, yeah, there are 6 strategies that we teach people to grow, but if I were to boil it down, every single one of those strategies, that's what it comes down to. So the question is, how willing are you to grow your show? How willing are you to do the work required to get the result that you want?
Well, and this is a perfect segue for me to give that opportunity for you to talk about your show, because people would be like, well, she missed that. So tell us a little bit about because I think first of all, I think everybody needs to go back and listen to this episode a second time, because I know if you're watching the video, like I've got my own notes that I'm like, okay, I have to go and listen to this. So do that and take your notes, but then talk to us about how people can connect with you, because I know that there's going to be people going, okay, I know I need to do the work, but I also know I want that person standing over my shoulder to go, try this.
Yes. So I have a podcast. Surprise, surprise. It's called Insider Secrets to a Top 100 Podcast. So if you want to learn what those insider secrets are, because there's no gatekeeping going on over here other than your content gatekeepers, which I will help you dial in. But come listen to the show. You can type my name in whatever platform that you get your podcast on, type in the title, type in my name, it'll pop up. Follow the show, listen to some episodes, take your notes, and actually commit to what it's going to take to get the result that you want. And then outside of that, if you want more from me and you want to connect with me, I would love nothing more than if you come find me on Instagram. I'm at the Courtney Elmer. Send me a DM. Let me know what your biggest takeaway was from this episode, because that helps me to create more content around those topics that you want to learn more about, which I can then share on the podcast. I can share on my Instagram. I can share with our newsletter list. We have a weekly digital, I say newsletter because it's like boring, right? Who wants another newsletter? But for lack of a better term, what this is a digital resource that we send out to our Own Your Voice insiders every week, called the Own Your Voice newsletter. And in there, I am teaching you how to grow your podcast, how to communicate more effectively and on an unconscious level with your listener. So each week there's some kind of training that goes out in written form that's short, it's digestible, but that you can walk away with some kind of action item that you can take action with. So you can connect with me on Instagram, and also on Instagram. If you click the link there, you can go to our website too. Either way, you'll find a link to one of our upcoming workshops where if you want to dive deeper, and this is specifically for those people who've been toying with the idea of launching a podcast, you've been thinking about it for 6 months or more. You've said to yourself, okay, this is my year. I'm going to make it happen. So if that's you, or if you're one of those people who's had your show for 6 months or more and you haven't yet crossed that 1,000 download per episode milestone, then in this workshop, we're going to dive deeper into these 3 ingredients. This workshop's totally free. I'm not pitching you into our program or anything like that on this workshop. It's 90 minutes of pure value and teaching. So you can either go to the link in my bio or go to our website to get the details and the date. We do them about once a month or so. So when you click that, you'll always get the latest information.
Well, we'll make sure that we include those links in our show notes and stuff like that too. Courtney, it has been such a pleasure. I'm going to have to go back and listen to this episode again just so I can sit, and really be an observer, because I think there's just so much that I know people are going to be watching, and you're going to start seeing my stuff change, because I already have ideas that I'm like, oh, I'm not doing that. I need to do that. I so appreciate your time. It's just been wonderful.
Oh, well, Tanya, thank you for having me. Look, I love this. And really, that is my whole heart. I mean, you heard me share that, right? If I can do one thing, which like this episode today, if I said one thing that helps someone trust their voice, use it in a bigger way, then my job is done. My work is done. So thank you for the opportunity to share today.
Well, I said I wanted to start 2024 off with an amazing guest, and Courtney definitely did not disappoint. One of the things that really still stuck with me, in after having this interview with her and then, through editing, was what she talked about, that we all want to create a greater impact. But to do that, we need to trust first what we have to say, and then step forth in courage to actually say that, and really to take a moment to see who and what are we giving our power and weight to in regards to their opinions and their thoughts. That was definitely something that made me go, man, I need to write this down. I want to know, what was it that resonated with you? What was it that made you go, boy, that is hitting a chord. I need to write this down. I need to remember this. Please message me and let me know. I am the one who answers all of my DMs on social medias and my emails. So make sure you reach out. I love hearing what your takeaways are, because I think they allow me to take a moment to go, oh, you know what? I never really thought of that. So keep sharing those. You'll also be able to head to our website at foxtalksbusiness.com. You'll be able to see all of the episodes, ways to get my new book, How to Collaborate, and all of the fun stuff we have coming up in 2024. As well, we have a few spots left in my year-long program. So if you're interested in that, you've always wanted to work with me, reach out. We can jump on a call and see if this program and this group that I have coming up is going to be a fit for you. So no matter what it is that you're doing today, make sure that you take time to stop and have fun. Because as I always say, if you're not having fun, why are you doing it?